as a society, we keep getting bigger. In 1986, shortly after I went into practice, there wasn't a single state in the United States with obesity saturation over 14%. Yet today, every state has managed to achieve that and more. In fact, now we have new colors showing the percentage of the population that have in fact achieved the exalted state of obesity. And what's interesting is these numbers actually underestimate the actual obesity because these are self-reported numbers. And it turns out people tend to be inaccurate and almost always underestimating their obesity, not overestimating it. So the reality is that people are much fatter than is indicated by this chart, but even this chart itself is rather shocking. 2/3 of people, in fact, are now overweight or obese. So if you are not overweight or obese, you are technically abnormal, because normal or average people are overweight. And it's not just the adipose tissue that's the problem. It's a particular type of fat that's most concerning, and that's visceral fat. Visceral fat is the fat that collects around the belly, around the organs, is most associated with the inflammatory markers, including IL-6 and TNF alpha and all these other markers that have been identified associated essentially with inflammation. And the more you're obese, the more visceral fat you have, the higher your risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, breast cancer, colorectal cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and others. The number of people in the United States of obesity is not only increasing, but all the diseases associated with it, as you would predict, are increasing. For example, if we look at the incidence of diabetes and compare it to the increasing obesity, the correlation coefficients are almost 1.0. It's almost like there's a connection. The fatter we get, the sicker we get. So what we're doing about it as a society is trying to convince people to eat health food. You know, olive oil and red wine and dark chocolate and coffee and coconut, and, you know, getting people to follow high fat, high protein, Atkins paleo type diets. And unfortunately, although some of these approaches may be effective at short-term weight loss, they may not necessarily be long-term sustainable health promoting habits. In my opinion, what we should be doing is, instead of hawking health foods, we should be focusing on healthy foods. And healthy foods are fruits and vegetables, grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, a whole plant food diet free of salt, oil, and sugar. Salt, oil, and sugar are actually not food. They're chemicals added to food that stimulate dopamine production in our brain that associated with pleasure. So it makes food more pleasurable to us, but not necessarily healthier. So we talk about a whole plant food SOS-free diet. SOS, of course, is the international symbol of danger, and it also includes salt, oil, and sugar. So we know that this pleasure trap, this artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain that comes from eating these highly processed foods, is leading people to obesity and metabolic syndrome. And that in turn is increasing people's dying from heart disease and cancer and autoimmune diseases, COVID-19 and everything else you can think of. So what are we going to do about it? Well, one practice that's been advocated is fasting. And there are some people like Walter Longo and others that have done tremendous research looking at a version of fasting called intermittent fasting, where people essentially limit their feeding window to between 8 and 12 hours a day. So if you limit your feeding window to, say, 8 hours a day, that would mean you'd have a 16-hour fast every day. And even that period of fasting, even that brief period of 16 hours of fasting, day after day after day, is thought to induce changes that are consistent with disease prevention, health promotion. Also very effective at helping aid people who are attempting to lose or maintain optimum weight. The way you would implement intermittent fasting essentially is by not eating 3 or 4 hours before you go to bed at night, perhaps delaying breakfast a little bit until you can get some exercise time in, and limit your feeding window to that 8 to 12 hour period. What I'm going to be speaking about at this point, though, is not intermittent fasting, but water-only fasting. So water-only fasting is defined as the complete abstinence from all substances except pure water in an environment of complete rest. Now, this type of fasting is taking that intermittent fasting and extending it for a longer period of time. Now, an important consideration when we're talking about longer-term fasting, particularly extended fasting, is that not everybody's a great candidate for fasting, that for some people this could be detrimental. So it's important to know if an individual is a good candidate for fasting before we undertake fasting for periods of anywhere from 5 to 40 days. And the way you determine that is with a medical history, a physical exam, and basic laboratory evaluation. This not only helps us determine who's a good candidate for fasting, but provides us the information necessary to monitor fasting patients to ensure that the process is going along properly. So there are some conditions and some individuals that would not be good candidates for fasting at a given point. If you're pregnant or lactating, fasting's not generally for you. If you're lactating and you fast, you're going to lose milk production. That's going to be a problem. If you have anorexia nervosa, which is a neurological condition, we would recommend against fasting. Even though these patients want to fast, it's not a health promoting intervention for that condition. If you have type 1 diabetes, that is, you don't produce enough insulin, you wouldn't be able to fast because you need a certain amount of insulin to be able to adapt to the fasting process. If you've had a recent stroke or myocardial infarction, if you had a pulmonary embolism, DVT, cardiac instability, or atrial fibrillation, fasting may not be the best thing for you because you're likely on anticoagulant therapy, which if you discontinue that rapidly can result in very negative outcomes. And so, these individuals may have to be stabilized before they would be candidates for water-only fasting. If you have severe kidney disease, the kidneys are a very important organ in your body. They purify the blood, essentially. And that's where most toxins that are in the body and that are going to be eliminated are eliminated through. You get a little bit through your stools, a little bit through the skin, but mostly it's through the urine, which is the byproduct of the blood being filtered by the kidneys. So if you don't have adequate kidney function, you may not be able to adapt safely to the fasting process. So it's important to measure kidney function before undergoing long-term fasting. If you have genetic defects, if you have porphyria, if you have medium chain acetylcoenzyme A dehydrogenase deficiency, you wouldn't be able to fast because you wouldn't be able to break down fatty acids and you would develop nausea and vomiting and then you would die, and that would be a bad thing. So we always test patients before fasting to make sure they don't have any of the things that would contraindicate fasting successfully. If you have deficiency, depletion, or cachexia, or you're on medications that can't be safely discontinued, fasting may not be for you. And if you can't rest, you shouldn't fast. It's very important for people to rest when they fast. If you rest when you fast, the majority of calories are burned from fat with a preferential focus on visceral fat. If you're very active when you're fasting, what you do is you force a process called gluconeogenesis. That's the breakdown of protein to provide the sugar that's needed by this extra activity, both from your brain and your muscles. And so then you would deplete vital reserves rather than focus on fat and fat mobilization. So the conditions that are most favorable to fasting, not surprisingly, are the conditions that are caused by dietary excess. Obesity, elevated blood levels, high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, as well as metabolic syndrome that we've talked about. Some conditions like lymphoma, which is a type of lymph cancer, respond well to fasting, and we'll discuss some of the outcome data that we've had experience with there. Gastrointestinal imbalances and alterations in the microbiome. It's interesting, humans have about 5 pounds of bacteria that live in their intestinal tract. That's 1 trillion creatures. That's a lot of creatures. And these are living creatures. They're eating and drinking and defecating inside you. I mean, when you really think about it, you've got 1 trillion creatures pooing inside your intestinal tract right now as we speak. And what they poo in you could be toxic waste, things like TMA, which becomes TMAO and can increase your risk of dying from colon cancer and heart disease. Or you could be pooing fertilizer in you, things like vitamin K and stuff you need to survive. And what determines what your organisms, what your microbiome poo in you depends on what you feed them. So we know if you feed them animal foods, meat, fish, fowl, and eggs, and dairy products, you get a completely different microbiome than people that are on plant-based diets. So one of the reasons why animal food consumers may have such a higher incidence of many diseases is in part because of the alterations in the microbiome. Healthy microbiome have maybe 1,000 different species of organisms. And it's thought that the broader your diversity, the more resilient and resistant you are to everything from heart disease and cancer to COVID-19. But when you feed the microbiome sugar, refined carbohydrates, animal foods, you alter the constituents in that flora tremendously. And then other things like antibiotics can actually have a devastating effect on the type of organisms and how they survive. So this becomes a very important process. And fasting actually reboots the entire microbiome. It's really quite fascinating. In fact, we've done the first research on the effect of long-term fasting on the gut microbiome. We did a study with Luigi Fontana from Washington University, and that study will be published later this year. Autoimmune diseases. Autoimmune diseases are diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, and ulcerative colitis, and ankylosing spondylitis, and lupus, and psoriasis, eczema, and asthma, and these conditions where it's actually your immune system attacking your own tissues that's responsible for the manifestations of disease. And so it turns out in fasting, there's a number of things that we'll discuss today that change, that are favorable at bringing autoimmune diseases under control. And then, of course, dependency and toxicity. Many people are addicted to things like drugs, like alcohol, like cocaine, and even to the artificial stimulation of dopamine in the brain that comes from chemicals out of the food, like sugar and oil. And so these dependencies can be rebooted with fasting. In fact, fasting is like taking a hard drive on a computer that's become corrupted. And if you reboot the hard drive, you turn the machine off, you turn it on, you don't always know exactly why, but now things start working better. And that's a reasonable analogy in humans. You shut everything down with fasting, you turn it back on, and you're able to create an environment that's more conducive for health recovery.